All right, all set?
I think so.
All right, perfect. Hello, everybody. My name is Cassandra Klett, and I'm an education specialist here at the Key West Art and Historical Society. Thank you for joining us this evening for Mallory O'Connor's talk, Strangers in a Strange Land, Picturing Florida's History Through Art. So before we begin, if you have any questions during the talk, please type them in the text box on your screen and hit send. At the end, we will answer as many questions as time will allow for. So as always, there's a donate button located at the top of your screen. If you enjoyed this talk, or if you'd like to help us continue to offer our virtual programming for free, please go ahead and hit that donate button. Any amount helps, and a huge thank you to everybody who's made a donation during our past lectures. So the program that you are about to see is supported by Florida Humanities, the state affiliate of the National Endowment for the Humanities. Florida Humanities funds and coordinates public humanities programs and publications that explore the people, places, and ideas that shape our state. In addition to this Florida Talks program, Florida Humanities provides grant funding to cultural institutions, brings traveling Smithsonian exhibits to rural and underserved communities, and publishes Forum, their award-winning magazine. Private contributions are critical to sustaining the programs of Florida Humanities. For more information on the organization and how to support it, visit floridahumanities.org. So our presenter this evening is Mallory O'Connor. She is a writer, an art historian, and a musician. She holds degrees in art history, and American history from Ohio University. For 20 years, she taught art history at the University of Florida and at Santa Fe College. During this time, she also wrote hundreds of magazine articles and critical essays and curated numerous exhibitions for museums and galleries. She is the author of 2 nonfiction books, Lost Cities of the Ancient Southeast and Florida's American Heritage River, both published by the University Press of Florida. As director of the Thomas Center Gallery, the primary cultural center of the city of Gainesville from '84 to '94, and the Santa Fe College Art Gallery from '94 to '99, Professor O'Connor organized numerous exhibitions, including highly successful shows on Florida art and history. Welcome, Mallory, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Cassandra, and it's a pleasure to be here with you today. And thanks also to the Key West Art and Historical Society and, of course, to the Florida Humanities Council, which has supported me through many different projects over the last 25 years. So it's been a pleasure always to work with them, and it's nice to be in a new place, Key West. I haven't been there for quite some time, so it's nice to be back. And I'm just pleased today to be able to talk to you about a topic that I've been interested in for quite a while, and I'll tell you what it is and why I'm interested in this lecture. I want to say that visual mythology is one way to describe art that creates and perpetuates perceptions of people, places, and cultural artifacts. Now, sometimes people say, oh, it's just a myth, or mythology, that means, it isn't really true. But actually, the word itself, mythology, comes from the Greek word mythos, which means what the people believe. In other words, popular culture. And Florida is very rich in what I like to call visual mythology, images that span centuries that attest to both the vivid imagination of the artists who have sought to capture the essence of an exotic and colorful landscape, and the equally flamboyant narratives that have fueled the region's reputation for novelty and eccentricity. The one consistent feature of Florida's cultural evolution has been change. As wave after wave of visitors and immigrants passed through Florida's space and time, and each new wave of people saw a different place. We may all inhabit the same space, but we live in different worlds. Works of art invite us into the intimate, personal world of one person, and that is the artist. So we can see the world through their eyes. As Jay Williams, curator of the Daytona Museum of Arts and Sciences, pointed out, Many of the artists who painted Florida scenes were themselves tourists or transplants. So they help us to see Florida as a special part of the South with attributes different from the rest of America. Each new wave of immigrants has carried to Florida a dream of a new life, a desire for renewal and rejuvenation. Surely these visions have profoundly shaped the state's history and culture. Here's what Christopher Columbus had to say. God made me the messenger of a new heaven and a new earth, of which he spoke in the Apocalypse of St. John, and he showed me the spot where to find it. The Americas, including Florida, have been above all the product of the European imagination. The representations of Florida given to us by generations of artists are likewise products of the imagination, and they reveal what I like to call a Florida of the mind. What we think of as Florida, they embody the myths that sustain our cultural identity, that inspires our hopes, our ambitions. Always, the greatest myths are the ones that we believe to ring true. They seem to have some kind of substance behind them. Now, Florida is far too diverse, culturally and environmentally, too spacious, too multifaceted to be summed up by one image. But when we finish looking for Florida, among the images that I'm going to show you today, maybe we'll be able to put together the pieces of a puzzle that form a true portrait. Let's look first of all at this painting by Salvador Dali, a Spanish artist, a surrealist. And the title of the painting is The Discovery of America by Christopher Columbus. Now, Dali painted this painting in 1958. Typically, his version is filled with symbols. He's more interested in the psychological impact of discovery than with the historical events. So Columbus here is shown not as a grown man, but as an adolescent boy, filled with youthful enthusiasm. Dali's wife, Gaia, is portrayed as the Virgin Mary on a banner that Columbus carries, representing the introduction of Christianity into the New World. Flags of various nations competing for dominance flutter in the background, and there were a bunch of them. Their horizontal forms countered by the vertical thrust of spears and crosses. Interesting combination. The ghostly image of a crucified Christ and the hooded monks holding crosses reinforce the religious fervor of the invading forces. In the foreground of the painting, and you can't see it very well in this image, but in the foreground, there is a pockmarked sea urchin, maybe a symbol of the ancient natural world that was soon going to be trampled by the arriving Europeans. Who discovered Florida? Well, you could say, oh, Columbus, or you could say, oh, Ponce de Leon. There's lots of different answers, but if you really look at the timeline and you look at the actual history, throughout its history, Florida has been a frontier and a port of entry between the old world and the new. And most America was systematically settled with a familiar landscape. Florida continues to be a sort of work in progress, an ongoing experiment. Thousands of years before the Europeans arrived, Native Americans made their way eastward across the continent, arriving in Florida sometime around 12,000 BC. That ancient date keeps getting questioned and reassessed, but that's about the best guess at this time. These early immigrants are known as Paleo-Indians, and Florida that they came to was drier and cooler when they arrived, a semi-barren wilderness of grassy savannas and scrub vegetation that supported a variety of wildlife, including now extinct species such as mammoth and mastodon. The Indians hunted these megafauna using nothing more than stone-tipped spears. Think about it. I go to a natural history museum and I see a skeleton of one of these ancient megafauna, as they're called, because they're really big. And I try to imagine trying to bring one of those guys down with a piece of stone on the end of a twig. I mean, it's ridiculous, but they did it. We know that they did it. We've seen the evidence that they did it, and they used mammoth, mastodon, other megafauna, and of course, whatever they could gather, as well as hunt, to sustain themselves. And the settlement into Florida was sporadic until the warming of the oceans brought about new cultures, distinctive cultures identified by pottery types, tools, weapons. Most of the early people, even those who built impressive mounds and semi-permanent structures, were hunters and gatherers. A few began to practice agriculture. By the 1st century BC, the Tequesta, an eastern variant of the Glades Indian culture, had established themselves in the area that would one day be known as Miami. Other early Floridians, the ancestors of the Timucua, the Apalachee, and the Calusa, settled along the coast and along the inland waterways throughout the state. Here is what's called a human effigy urn. We call it that because it was meant to contain the cremated remains of someone who was fairly significant in the community. They went to a lot of trouble to create this 18-inch high polychrome, that means multicolored, ceramic urn. And this is by a group of people called the Weeden Island culture. They were, we know, in the North Florida area around 800 AD. So right, up almost until the time of the first contact with Europeans. So this particular urn was found in a mound near Fort Walton Beach. Evidence of the Weeden Island culture has been found inland throughout North Florida. Villages with broad plazas and distinctive burial mounds characterized the culture, indicating a strong socio-political hierarchy and a pretty advanced technology. So these were the Indians that came right before the infiltration of the Europeans. The Buck Mound urn depicts a masked human wearing a red and white cape that's been incised with a depiction of feathers. He's seated on a stool, likely indicating his prestige within the community, a little throne, if you will. The artist used a combination of modeling, coiling, and slab construction to create this exotic sculpture that was intended for ceremonial use. The urn originally held, as I mentioned, the cremated remains of an individual, and it had been ritually broken and the fragments scattered over the floor of an earth mound in which it was buried. The image of figures wearing feathered capes are associated with a figure of great importance in the ceremonial life of pre-Columbian Indians in the Southeast, a bird man, or as they called him sometimes, the falcon impersonator. Whether the Buck Mound urn is meant to represent a deity or a powerful human leader or shaman, the sculpture gives us a glimpse into the inner life of Florida's indigenous people. Here's some other examples of early Florida Indian art. This is an engraved turtle shell from Key Marco, the Calusa culture, from about 600 to 800 AD, and depicts two leaping dolphins. I find those dolphins to be so lively. It's just really amazing. And just using some sharp instrument to engrave these lines and then rubbing the shell with some darker material to fill in the lines is a very interesting technique. This is a Timucuan figure from the Timucuan Preserve further north, 600 AD, and also made out of ceramic. Again, a lively little fellow, and shows, I think, that the Timucua and the other early Indians had a very lively sense of imagination. They also had a bit of a sense of humor. When you look at some of their images, they're kind of sly and funny. And they give you some details in terms of headdress or a costume sometime that help us to envision what these early people looked like and how they lived. Here is a painting, we think, by the French navigator and artist Jacques Lemoyne de Milieu. Jacques Lemoyne came to the New World under the auspices of René de Laudonnière, and he was a French explorer. Lemoyne was his artist on board for the expedition, and came to Florida, and Laudonnière asked Lemoyne to please make images of everything that he saw. So Lemoyne, we think, created a bunch of different images and took them back to Europe with him, or redid them once he got back to Europe. This is an image that supposedly shows Laudonnière. Jacques Lemoyne did this image of Laudonnière, and the Indian chief, Athor, at Ribot's column, done in 1564. Now, there's since been some discussion about whether this painting is actually authentic or not. So, as I said, when you get back into this kind of time frame, sometimes you have to rethink some of the images, where they came from, how valid they are, who might have done them. Is it the artist that's named or someone else that wanted to take credit? So there's a lot of different options going on here. Here's the ruins of an old Florida mission. And the artist that originally did this work called it a Florida mission, but actually it turns out that it wasn't really a mission. Most of the Florida missions were not built out of stone. They were built out of wood, and that's one reason why we don't have very many good examples of them left. We would like to think that we're looking at something that the Spanish made out of stone, but in fact, most of the missions, as I say, were made out of wood and didn't last. This is probably actually a sugar house that was built for business purposes rather than for religious purposes. The myth of Arcadia, that promised a land of milk and honey, proved to be a potent image for the Europeans who came to this new world, as much as that of El Dorado when it came to sustaining an idyllic vision of La Florida. The Spanish envisioned Eden as a place where one found an easy fortune, where sustenance was available without effort, but the English viewed it as a land awaiting cultivation. However, it was the Spanish that laid the groundwork for later agricultural industries, especially in Florida, because they introduced three things that would become a basis of Florida's agricultural fortune: citrus, cattle, and horses. Here is a orange crate label. Reed and Reed shippers find citrus fruit gift boxes from St. Petersburg, Florida. You've probably seen some of these citrus labels. Today, more than 169,000 acres of citrus are grown in the St. Johns River Basin. And despite ongoing problems with periodic freezes, oranges have continued to be an important part of Florida's economy. On the left is a painting by Kate Barnes. Kate lives in Cross Creek, and she was born and raised in the Midwest and educated at the School of the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston and the Cleveland Institute of Art. But she then completed her formal art training in Japan, And it maintains the Japanese influence, can be seen in some of her nature works. You might notice the very lively oak tree here with its curving branches. In the early 1980s, Cross Creek, Orange Lake, and Lochaloosa were threatened by a proposal for a massive housing development encompassing the communities of Cross Creek and its sensitive environment. A group of residences formed the Friends of Cross Creek, a grassroots environmental group led by Kate that was eventually successful in preserving the historic community and conserved over 50 square miles of real Florida. Kate is a great admirer of what we call cracker architecture, and painted this watercolor in a typical cracker cabin by combining the various elements from several local houses. Part of the Spanish plan to colonize Florida was to establish large ranchos throughout the region. Even though the Spanish were eventually repelled, the bloodlines of the cattle and horses that they brought to Florida remained after they left. When they were driven out of Florida, the Spanish left behind their herds of cattle and horses. The Seminole Indians were quick to take over the herds. And when William Bartram first visited Florida in 1774, he wrote enthusiastically about the innumerable droves of cattle that grazed on the Alachua savanna, and noticed that the local Indians had become prosperous from ranching. As more and more settlers moved into the region, cattle ranching became a major industry, and soon cattle had spread all along the links of the St. Johns and westward into the Florida interior. Here is a drawing, well, black and white work by Frederick Remington called Fight Over a Stolen Herd. And it was something that pretty much depicted some of the so-called range wars that took place throughout Florida during this time period. When the Spanish ceded Florida to the British in 1763, many of the Spaniards left for Cuba. Their departure left a population vacuum in the region that was soon filled by a new group, a mixture of Creek Indians from Georgia and Alabama that moved southward because they were being displaced by settlers further to the north. These newcomers, encouraged by the abandoned fields and orchards and the herds of cattle, found North Florida well suited to their needs. The Spanish officials were happy to have the Creeks in the area as a buffer against the growing British threat in the Carolinas and Georgia. And over the next few decades, as the Florida Creeks began to modify their culture based on their new surroundings, they developed a new identity and now became known as the Seminoles. This is a painting by a contemporary artist named Theodore Morris. Theodore Morris paints images of the Florida Indians and of various time periods, and he does exquisite research. So every item that he incorporates into his artworks are as accurate and as authentic as he can manage them to be based on archaeological evidence. So it's not just a kind of imagination that's at work here, but actually trying to ferret out exactly what the Indians would have looked like, what costumes they wore, what their surroundings would have been, and so on. Let's see. This is Jackson Walker, a painting called The Capture of Osceola that shows Osceola, who was tricked into being taken by the other side, the American forces, and put into prison from where he eventually died. But this is Jackson Walker is another contemporary artist who uses history as a point of departure and is very careful again about his research. Well, the Spanish had opened the door to a new world, but the French and the English quickly established their own presence, and Florida would become a frontier for ever-expanding floods of immigrants that would diversify the region's cultural identity and lead to 5 centuries of amazing growth and development. Artist naturalists were at the forefront of these peaceful invaders who followed narrow paths into an unknown wilderness and set the stage for settlement and colonization. Here is a interesting work by a French artist named André Thevet. He never came to the North American area. He had his reputation established by being on one trip to the South American region, but he listened to what people said, and in 1557 he created this image of what he called a mythical beast, and said that he had heard word that this beast lived on the shores of the St. Johns River in Florida, and it had the head of a gargoyle, and it had clawed feet and a tail like a plume, and it carried its demon children on its back. Can any of you guess what it might be? If you said a possum, you'd be right. They think that this is really an image of an opossum. But if somebody described a possum to you, with clawed feet and a big tail and carried its children on its back, maybe you'd come up with something similar to this if you hadn't seen it. Early American naturalists were rooted in the tradition of the period known as the Enlightenment, a time of increasingly rigorous scientific inquiry based on the power of reason. And according to the tenets of the British Royal Society, founded in 1660, knowledge should be tested by making observations in the field. So by the third decade of the 1700s, London had become the self-proclaimed center of the new science, a science based on empirical observation and rational inquiry. Members of the Royal Society were not willing to publicly acknowledge their debt to the colonial naturalists who were key to the development of European natural history, but they were not shy about requesting specimens, funding explorations, or encouraging inquiry. Florida has always been a naturalist paradise, and over time, artist naturalists have sketched and pressed and painted and photographed and videotaped almost every square inch of the state, and new wonders are still being found, whether they're the bones of ancient megafauna or tiny living creatures that have simply managed to escape detection. There were several early artist naturalists that gave us a interesting look at the New World and who played an important role in exploring and documenting Florida's spectacular biodiversity. And they are Mark Catesby, William Bartram, and John James Audubon. What were they looking for, and what did they find? Mark Catesby arrived in America in 1722. He was on assignment from his English patrons to collect plants and animals and to visually document the native flora and fauna. He did his field work under trying circumstances. Imagine it now. Tramping through the wilderness, he daily faced a variety of dangers, including poisonous snakes, infections, fierce weather conditions, a chronic lack of supplies. From the local Indians, however, he received hospitality and assistance. He was amazed. Back in England in 1726, he created 263 watercolor paintings that documented his findings. And these he put together in a book called The Natural History of Carolina, Florida, and the Bahama Islands. Published before the American Revolution, it was one of the most comprehensively illustrated documentations of the plants and animals of the New World. And on the right, you see his buffalo with the acacia tree. His paintings and drawings are always very lively, sometimes whimsical. The book on the left is a biography, The Curious Mr. Catesby, and he certainly was curious. All creation, certainly he thought, deserved respect and attention. second artist naturalist in the area was William Bartram. And Bartram was the first American natural-born naturalist who didn't come over from Europe, although he had close contacts with the European population, and especially with the Royal Society. His father was connected particularly with the Royal Society, and was John Bartram, William's father, was in fact appointed as the botanist to the King of England prior to the Revolution. Bartram, his son, was always a talented artist and always enthralled with the natural world. He came to Florida first with his father on an expedition before Florida had been taken over by the English, and then came back on his own in right around the time of the Revolution, just prior to the Revolution, in order to see the peninsula of Florida for himself, and also trekked all through the Southeast, making notes, keeping journals, making drawings, just a fantastic illustrator of all of the wonders that he saw. And one of his favorite, or one of my favorite anyway, images that Bartram produced is this image of alligators. He was absolutely enthralled by alligators. He was scared to death of them. The man was not too stupid, but he nevertheless loved to draw and paint alligators. And here he has two alligators. They look a little bit more like dinosaurs, but two alligators of the St. John's. And he described them in great detail, including the ferocious battles that the alligators had. Some of his writings were absolutely, well, he was at the beginning of the Romantic period, and sometimes he sort of ran away with himself in terms of his vivid and flamboyant descriptions. Bartram was first and foremost a botanist, however, and most of his life he made his living tending the gardens of his father's nursery, and was much in demand as a horticultural consultant back in Philadelphia, where his family's property was. He discovered and described hundreds of plant specimens during his time in Florida travels. The Little Flower illustrated, wait a minute now, this is not the Little Flower, this is the lotus seed pod, snail shell, and blackroot. So this is a combination, and he frequently put things in combination that he found in the natural environment. You might notice the dragonfly also, and a bird is pictured here. So he was not only interested in the individual specimens of these various plants and creatures, he also wanted to put them into context. So he had, you might say, an ecological or even an environmental vision of the interconnectedness of all of these various life forms. Audubon is the third of the artist naturalists that we remember documenting the flora and fauna of Florida, as well as elsewhere. And his story has been so romanticized that it's sometimes difficult to distinguish fact from fiction. He was born in the West Indies. He was sent to France for his education. At 18, he came back to America to manage his father's estate, but left after a quarrel with the estate's overseer. Over the next few years, he drifted from one failed enterprise to another. He got married, and he developed an interest in natural history. He started painting birds using a new technique of sketching recently killed birds instead of working from stuffed specimens. That's one reason his paintings of birds are so lively. And almost all of them, he said, were killed by myself after I had examined their motions and habits and were regularly drawn on the spot where I procured them. So even though he killed them so that they'd stay still and he could make detailed illustrations of them, he still wanted to see them in their natural environment. And like his predecessor, William Bartram, he proved himself to be a dismal failure as a businessman, but distinguished himself as an artist, a scientist, and a traveler who popularized the study of nature, and particularly birds, at a time when most of his contemporaries looked on the wilderness and its inhabitants as sort of nuisances. In 1831, he traveled to Florida, promising to go further down the peninsula than any of his naturalist predecessors. Because he had won membership in London's Royal Society, he was able to obtain U.S. permission to travel on a government cruiser, the Spark, which regularly patrolled Florida's wilderness waters. Once aboard and sailing up the St. Johns, remember that would be from north to south, would be going up the St. Johns toward its beginnings in the Florida swamps in the southern part of the state. He said, "I have been deceived most shamefully about the Floridas." This was a letter he wrote to his wife. "My account of what I have or shall see of Florida will be far, very far from corroborating the flowery sayings of Mr. Barton." I think he meant to misspell Bartram. He said, "The river St. John's did not seem to me equal in beauty to the fair Ohio. The shores in many places are low and swampy, fully 100 miles from the mouth of the river, and the fog so thick that neither the shores could be seen, and yet the river was not a mile in breadth. The mosquitoes cover every object, even the cabin of the boat, and so wonderfully abundant were these tormentors that they more than once fairly extinguished the candles whilst I was writing in my journal." Well, he didn't seem to be too pleased about Florida. He later described the St. John's area as the place where all that is not mud, mud, mud is sand, 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 and where the fruit is so sour that it's not edible, and where in place of singing birds and golden fishes, you have alligators, snakes, scorpions, and other insects. Wow. From the start, Florida has been a land of dreams, romanticized landscapes built on fairy tales and pictures that have played a vital role in establishing and perpetuating the paradise image of Florida, an image meant to convey a sense of place, not necessarily as it actually existed, but as the artist and maybe the viewer also wanted it to be. 19th century landscape painters were inspired by the transcendentalist philosophy of divine nature, and they recognized the benefits they might deserve or derive from satisfying the public's enormous appetite for picturesque scenes. This is Martin Johnson Head, a painting called Florida Marsh, done in 1887. George Loring Brown, the Okefenokee Swamp. Contemporary artists have continued, and this is 1866, so it's not contemporary, but look how dramatic his picture is of the Florida swamp. Contemporary artists have continued to explore the exotic realm of Florida's wild nature. Over on the left is Peter Carolyn's Payne's Prairie Palms. And on the right is something done by, and I'll get that to that in a minute, the Florida Highwaymen. But of the painting by Peter Carolyn, he says, "Other states have mountains. Florida has clouds." And that's also something that was pointed out by Clyde Butcher, who's a Florida photographer that's well known for his images of the Everglades. "Other states have mountains. Florida has clouds." From tiny popcorn cumulus to magnificent cumulonimbus, Peter Carolyn is fascinated by clouds. "I'm interested in the color and the structure," he said. "As the tops grow and expand, I enjoy watching the surface puff and froth. It's a floating avalanche, a cascade in slow motion. I'm interested in capturing that frozen moment before the avalanche falls and the rains begin. Artists are always trying to capture this weird experience, the motion in a still image." On the right is work done by Harold Newton, who is one of the group's called the Highwaymen. And the Highwaymen were involved in painting Florida landscapes, but and they're called the Highwaymen because they painted lots and lots of images and could sell them for cheaply. And they often had a bunch of them in their car and just pulled over on the edge of the highway, opened the car up, set some out, and sold them to tourists who were on the highway. So this untitled image of Florida is maybe not exactly what Harold Newton saw, but it's what the public thought should be there. This is, again, that Florida of the mind. What do you have to have in a picture of Florida? You have to have palm trees. It's nice if you have water and exotic birds and a tropical sunset. This kind of sums up that sort of image that everybody believes is what Florida should look like. Margaret Ross Tolbert is a painter based in Gainesville. And over the last 20 years, she has executed a series of paintings, drawings, and lithographs from studies in the US, France, and Turkey. But a continuing focal point are the springs of North Florida, whose presence provides a sense of ideal sense of the destination and the exotic qualities of the landscape. So here's two views of the springs. In the 19th century, Florida springs were seen as, kind of a place where you could come and take the waters in the European sense. They were thought to have curative and healing benefits. And so people came, and these resorts cropped up around springs where people could come and bathe in the waters. Margaret's more interested in the springs that are still wild, the springs in North Florida, on the Santa Fe River, or other springs in the area. And she says, when I first began painting the springs, I saw them as prisms of space and light, a clear and transparent space inviting entry. I might mention she's also a diver. And so a lot of her springs images, like the one on the right here, are actually things that she saw underwater, looking up toward the edge of the land, the bank that she depicts across the top of the painting. So they're sort of underwater springs paintings. She says, later I began to see the springs as a force, a visible and palpable force, emanating from the caverns of the aquifer, carrying myriads of starry flecks of lime rock as it gushes into the headspring basin. If I swam down a spring-fed river like the Ichetucknee or the Rainbow, it seemed that this flow and this force postulated a new concept of space. Space was being in the force of the springs, and when one was in the water, this force seemed to define the boundaries of the universe in which it existed. Finally, I realized that part of the change of my perception of the nature of the springs came about because many of the springs had become this viable force. There are more nutrients and therefore more detritus and vegetation in the water, and it makes it visible. It's no longer gin clear. I don't want these paintings of light and clarity to be historical documents. I love to document the springs, but what I'm finding more and more is the fragile character of their existence. Just a note of this, she had a retrospective of exhibition of her springs paintings a few years ago. And she said it really impressed on her the fact that when she started painting them, they were bright blue and turquoise and so clear, and that the most recent paintings were green and had strands of algae in them. She said, oh my God, I've documented this destruction that's taken place at the springs over the past 20 years. Diversity is a value worth cherishing and nurturing, said John Meacham of Newsweek. The official Florida license plate featured a phrase called myflorida.com, arranged in a grand arc. But just whose Florida is it anyway? The arrival of the Europeans signaled the beginning of a fantastic in-migration of people from distant lands who over time created a multicultural mosaic that is one of Florida's most salient features. So in Picturing Florida, we'll take a quick look at some of the different people that arrived. Here is Mitch Colby, for example, oyster shuckers in Apalachicola. And then a totally different view by Mike Siegel of Pelican Cove in Cedar Key. Here's Frank Shapley's The Slave Market and Winslow Homer's Picking Cotton, documenting the arrival, not always such a great story, of African Americans in Florida. But later on, African Americans were able to make commentaries about Florida, what they found here. The one on the left is a painting by Purvis Young called Reaching Up for a Better Life from 1989. It's done in house paint on wood. Purvis Young sometimes just resorts to whatever materials are available, but he became an artist of the street without formal training, making art generated by obsession and desperation. He substituted a lack of formal education with intensive reading and study, and was very sophisticated about the history of art. He applied his personal worldview to the medium of paint to create a visual language that expresses his concerns as it captures the life of the people and the city around him. Joey Smolin on the right painted this image. It's acrylic and pen and ink on paper, mounted on canvas board. It's called Black People Get Hungry Too. And it shows them standing in line at the door of the church, hoping to get something to eat and drink. There's also a distinctive Asian culture in Florida that some people aren't as aware of, but here is the Murakami Museum and Gardens, which is down in Central Florida, and absolutely beautiful. If you hadn't had a chance to visit the Murakami Gardens, they're incredibly beautiful example of Asian art and culture, with the Japanese gardens and Japanese sculptures incorporated into it. So great way to look at the Japanese heritage that some people forget is part of our Florida culture. Gary Monroe, a photographer who has documented Jewish life in the South Beach area, did this photograph on the left called South Beach Sabbath. And hundreds of small hotels and apartments that make up South Beach, with roots extending back to the shuttles of Eastern Europe. Survivors of the Tsarist pogroms and the Nazi Holocaust immigrated to America, mostly through Ellis Island. After 100 years of toil, they established South Beach as the sort of last resort, you might say. And numerous Jewish men and women lived in the community and small-scale neighborhoods in Miami Beach, taking advantage of the tropical climate and the therapeutic ocean. Another group that we're not often aware of in this area is the Greek influence. Tarpon Springs, you can find an incredibly intense Greek colony there, community with all the sort of remnants of Greek colonies, churches, and sorts of celebrations. So Mitch Colby captures that here in his painting called Greek Easter. And then, of course, there is the Cuban influence in Florida art and their particular vision of Florida art and history. In 1986, Miami poet and writer Ricardo Pollosa wrote an essay titled The Tradition of Ambiguity, the Art of Being Out of Place. And that addressed the artist expatriate's experience, which he called a peculiar condition of exile in the United States. Most of the artists that I'm showing you here, Gilberto Ruiz, Susana Sori, were born in Cuba. Their parents fled the Cuban Revolution. They made their way to the sanctuary of Florida. And the condition of being an expatriate is a popular theme in the art and literature of these people who were really forced out of their traditional homeland and created a new life for themselves in Florida. Pagliuosa writes, it's a tumultuous, as they have been so filled with the fluid ease of flight from one place to another. A short plane trip, and more than light, climate and tongue change, and yet nothing does. The expatriate never unpacks from his soul the razors of anxiety that have brought him here, and that always threaten to overtake those other aspects of his soul that might define him. So Gilberto Ruiz shows us his depiction of the appearance of a comet. And so here he flies through the air over a Florida swamp, headlong into the comet. Susana Sori, over on the right, works with psychic phenomena. And so her ceramic pieces and her sculptures tend to reflect that interest in the paranormal. Florida witnessed amazing growth and development from the late 19th century through the 20th century. Anything and everything was possible in a state that attracted entrepreneurs and developers, driven by grandiose dreams and the creative schemes to sell them. No other state mastered the arts of propaganda, the ability to invent and promote itself, as well as Florida. That's from the Journal of Propaganda Arts in the Wilsonian Florida International University collection. Florida has been marketed as an opportunity source, as a vacation paradise, and as a retirement haven since at least the 1830s. Here's two early examples. Over on the left is a painting that shows the Ocklawaha River steamer. It wasn't that people used to come for the beaches, they came for the rivers. And the steamers that ran into the heart of Florida along the mysterious Ocklawaha, where people saw alligators and bird life and waterways that they could never imagine that they would have seen. And then, of course, there's the whole Fountain of Youth mythology. I love that one. It's absolutely kind of amazing. And the Fountain of Youth, of course, we all know Ponce de Leon, right, came to Florida seeking the Fountain of Youth. Well, not actually, he was seeking gold, but, and never mind. We say that he was seeking the Fountain of Youth. And you can still go, and everybody wants to claim, oh, I have the Fountain of Youth, the real Fountain of Youth. St. Augustine is the most long-winded of this argument. And this poster from shows the 1513 Ponce de Leon finding the Fountain of Youth in St. Augustine. Well, supposedly, according to other places, he also found it near Tallahassee and down near Tampa and in South Florida. So this Fountain of Youth seems to be a sort of Florida phenomena. And Christopher Still, a contemporary artist, did this wonderful image for a mural up in Tallahassee of Ponce de Leon in Florida, lifting a glass, toasting his discovery of the Fountain of Youth. Here's a St. Augustine postcard on the right showing the Fountain of Youth, and Thomas Moran's Ponce de Leon in Florida over on the left, showing us a kind of spectacular wilderness paradise. And it still has great credence today. We see Florida as a stage set for all kinds of amazing things, like the mermaids of Weeki Wachee, Chris Collard's painting over on the left, a movie poster from Pirates of the Caribbean showing supposedly Ponce de Leon over on the right, and just all kinds of exotic images. Here we are. What one of our favorite tourist destinations, of course, that just celebrated its 50th anniversary. Why? Disney World. And Mitch Colby paints a painting called Are We There Yet? And it seems that they have arrived right in front of Cinderella's castle, the main entrance to Fantasyland, and one of the most photographed buildings in Walt Disney World. It stands 180 feet tall with graceful spires and towers that were inspired by French castles. The fairy tale castle may look like the real thing, but it's actually, of course, made out of steel beams and fiberglass, not bricks. But you'll find the Disney family coat of arms displayed inside. And as you walk through the castle, you'll see intricate mosaic murals, masterpieces that were made from 1 million pieces of Italian glass, in addition to silver and 14-karat gold. So, about his painting of the Ott family in front of the castle, Mitch Colby writes, "The title is an obvious reference to what we all asked our parents as we traveled on vacations as children. Are we there yet?" This painting, I suppose, is my homage to Norman Rockwell and was commissioned by my good friends, the Ott family. Each child's personality is immediately apparent and seems to show everything from bliss to complete boredom. If the oyster shuckers painting shows one aspect of real Florida, then this is the flip side. Love it or hate it, Disney is now a permanent fixture of Florida and part of our state's largest industry, tourism. Finally, over on the right, Cindy McKenna captures a kind of postmodern possibility, rapture in the postmodern age, 2010, an oil on canvas with this spectacular storm clouds and crescent moon above a crammed highway that seems to be stalled in perpetual traffic. Ultimately, Florida has it all, the best and the worst of everything. Beaches, palms, flamingos, oranges, rosy sunsets, it's all here. But also there are rattlers and gangsters and heedless development. Art provides us with visual homilies, little sermons about daily survival, social interaction, and the look and feel of our landscape. And all of it, of course, dominated by a beautiful and wonderful nature. And we shouldn't forget that that's the most amazing part of Florida. Okay, that's what I had to tell you. I hope you enjoyed it. And Cassandra, if anybody has any questions. Okay, and they do down here. Okay, let's see. Wow, all right. Who was the artist for the ruins of the old Florida mission? And oh boy, I'd have to look back at that real quick. Where is our old Florida mission? Da, 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 da. Let me see if I can find it in my notes here. His name just went out of my head. Oh, I don't have it on my. There it is, the ruins of an old Florida mission. I'd have to get back to you. I've got it in my notes somewhere, but I can't tell you right off the top of my head. Let's see. My understanding of the Highwaymen was that they were Black artists and galleries would not show their work. I bought an Alfred Hare painting. Oh, good for you. And still have it 50 years later, 50 years ago, when I was a student at Florida Keys Community College. Back in the day, the dorm was a houseboat. Oh my goodness, that sounds wonderful, actually. They studied with Beanie Bacchus, who was a South Florida landscape painter. They just kind of started hanging around, and Beanie decided he should teach them to paint and that they would be able to make a good living that way. And yes, the galleries wouldn't show their work, didn't take them seriously, but Beanie did, and he essentially showed them how they could make a living making their art. And even if of course now the galleries, it's in a lot of galleries and has become very popular in their exhibitions and collections and so on. But it took a while for that to really get started. And now, of course, their art is very, very valuable. And they finally come kind of full turn. I hope you've had a chance to look at Gary Monroe's book on the Highwaymen. He did a beautiful book that kind of goes through all of the background of the Highwaymen story and how it was that they came to create the kind of art that they did. Okay, it is commendable. You give the full credit due to the European imagination of the past in making the now Florida, while not minimizing the native. Can't see that on my screen here. Okay. What is your perspective on the visual future of the Sunshine State as distinct from other locales? Oh gosh. The visual future of the Sunshine State. Well, we'll hope that it's not, what did I say? Sidney McKenna's view. I can't see the whole group of them here, so I'll have to just go through it quickly. To the last one, we have all these beautiful 19th century and then early 20th century. And there's Sidney's vision of the future, you might say, visual future of the Sunshine State. I don't know, a lot of it's going to depend on what happens with climate disruption and change. Florida may come out of that one better than some other places because it may still have adequate water. So I don't know whether, I think people are going to, of course, move away from the edges from the seashore because there's going to be a lot of sea rise inundation of places that have been iconic to Florida, like South Beach. I think that if we can manage to preserve some of the beautiful natural features of the interior, that it could be almost, it would be so wonderful if that whole interior area with springs and so on could just be a park and allow future people to see what Florida was like, what it once was. I don't know, that's my sort of sappy idea of what I think should be the case. Anyway, and I hope that you really did enjoy this overview. And I thank you very much for being an audience and listening to it and asking some good questions. Okay. Hey,
All right.
Cassandra.
Hello. All right, I didn't see any more questions on here. Everyone just keeps saying thank you, so I'll keep sending those through. But thank you again to everyone for joining us this evening. When the event ends, a survey will pop up on your screen. If you do have a couple moments, please go ahead and fill this short survey out. The information gives the Florida Humanities information, such as how we did today, and also how you heard about these talks. If you'd like to fill it out, but you don't have time at the moment, there will be a thank you email coming through shortly, and there will also be a link to that survey there. So our next virtual talk will be with Corey next week on October 13th for her happy hour with a historian, and the topic will be John James Audubon in Florida. So we hope to see everybody again there. And thank you, Mallory. Have a great evening, everybody.
Thank you. Take care.